Thank you so much, Frederik. Am I audible, Frederik, to you? Could you get me, Frederik?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Frederik, for your presentation. And well, I already circulated your full paper to our research scholars and colleagues, and it is great that you have decided to keep it open access, which is also remarkable, because otherwise it is very difficult to have access from here to read good journal papers. We can have one or two questions, keeping in mind the time factor. I have one question. I take the privilege to read out that question to you first, and then I think we can have one or two questions from the research scholars and other colleagues present here. I mean, you did mention about listing as a cultural practice which is integral to the religious canon of Buddhism. You mentioned that in your speech, and while reading the paper, I could see that is an amazing example. When I was talking to my colleague Manos Dotto while coming today to the institute, that this is a fascinating example of looking into the notebooks of someone and reading those entries in such a wonderful way, so that we open it up for larger insights on Buddhism, on colonial history, the bureaucratic system of indexing and categorization and listing, as you mentioned. And I was also highly excited to see that how you have wonderfully integrated with these reading theoretical underpinnings of emotion. I mean, how you integrated your study of the notebooks with the larger theoretical studies of emotion as such. So this is amazing in that way, a great deal to understand how to do research. And I think our research scholars will also be benefited reading this. Now my question is, and this is from page 5 of the paper, where you said that listing is a cultural technique that performs ontic operations that inscribes concepts and categories upon which technical systems and social institutions are built. And then again, down below, you also said that listing is a cultural technique central to Buddhism, and in particular to the ancient Theravada Pali literature that Anagarika Dharmapala spent his life studying. So I know that you did mention about it during the course of your lecture, but yes, maybe because of the paucity of time allotted, you couldn't elaborate on it. Would you like to say a little bit more on how we get to know further about the Buddhist canon and the practice of listing as kind of an integral part of that canon?
All right. Well, thank you so much for this question, and thank you so much for taking the time to read this article, which really just started as a small curiosity that I stumbled across in the archive, and then I thought maybe it's worth sharing. So I'm really humbled by the fact that it resonates. And I also want to mention, well, I mean, thank you for sort of the applauding open access publication, but it's really also a function of privilege, isn't it? It's because my institute pays for open access fees. And so this is another, very direct way in which inequality structures global academia. And you can see this also because I'm also the editor of a journal, and you can see that with the sort of push towards open access, it really also becomes a push that pushes out certain scholars. Because if all publications have to be open access, then the funds have to come from somewhere. And if we're looking at publication open access fees of sometimes $2,300 or $2,500 per article, what institution is going to be able to fund all of its scholars to cover these publication fees? So what I fear is that we will really see a paucity of scholarship, particularly from the Global South, as open access, if open access is pushed forward in this way, and we cannot find better structures of keeping access open. Anyway, let me return to your question. Well, yeah, there are several aspects to this, right? And I didn't really talk about the aspect of emotions in the list, but of course, you know, working at the Center for the History of Emotions, I was also particularly interested in this. And the question is really seeing the list not just as a sort of something, a form of evidence that we find in our primary sources that tells us something about events that have taken place or books that you know, Dhammapada had read or things like that. But we also, I think, have to see it as a practice, as a highly performative thing. So, you know, sort of Dhammapada was taking these notebooks, was writing his diaries, and as we do in our daily life now, perhaps, you know, if somebody is fond of writing to-do lists, it helps us structure our days, but it also, I think, has an emotional function. And so a figure like Dharmapala was paradoxical in the way that he was, on the one hand, he was very privileged. His family, you know, his father had a large business in basically the wood industry in Ceylon, and then the furniture industry. And his so Dhammapada was fortunate in the sense that his family could fund this lifestyle that he led of focusing on spiritual pursuits, and then he also had a few other notable donors. At the same time, when we look through his notebooks and his diaries, we also see that there is a constant concern with money, with accounting, and with having to account to other people. So there is a sense of very acute precariousness also in his life, which becomes more apparent in certain instances, such as when he was interned in Kolkata for a few years by the colonial government, but also more generally in the sense that he constantly has to report on what he spent, on what, etc. So I believe that through the sort of the practice of compiling all of these lists, which I think in part he learned in the few years that he was working for the colonial administration. And then we also have to remember that he went to Christian schools, to colonial schools in sort of when he was younger. And you know, because his list making is extremely neat. These are, sometimes you can see some scribbled lists and you probably think, oh, you know, he was just sort of recording this on the side, or he didn't have much time. But he was also extremely diligent in the lists that he took. So we can see a very diligent handwriting, we can see lines drawn, particular formats, etc. And the same we can also see in his engagement with Buddhist philosophy, where it borders the point that his handwriting changes a lot out of respect. And so this respect for his engagement with the Buddhist tradition, but also this care in the compiling of more everyday sort of quotidian lists, I think speaks of a very strong sort of emotional life that is also behind these lists, and that includes uncertainty, but that also includes devotion, for example, in the compiling of religious lists. And then, so apart from all of this, you know, sort of situating Dhammapada also as a figure in the interface with colonial modernity, as you mentioned, the list is really central to the Theravada Buddhist tradition. Lists, and then also, of course, the topic of repetition. Yeah, so the way that early Buddhist literature is composed is that it has, it's full of pericopes, it's full of sentences and phrases that are repeated over and over across the literature. And the list, in its most simple form in the Pali canon, is a mnemonic device. It's a device for remembering. Yeah? And we can all relate to this from our student days, I guess. You know, you make lists of historical events or vocabulary lists, etc. All of these lists we can see in Dhammapada diaries. He was also compiling vocabulary lists, including Persian and Japanese. But then the list is also more. And if we remember that matrika comes from the Sanskritic root matra, matrika, so it's also, the list is also a kind of a mother. It is something from which something emerges. It is something out of which something grows, in a sense. And this is, we can see this very clearly in Buddhist philosophy, in the way that very often we have numbered lists there are the so and so many paramitas, there are the so and so many poisons, there are the so and so many virtues, and then often we have subdivisions, each one of them further subdivides into several others. So we have lists nested in lists, nested in lists. But lists don't exist only, I believe, on some kind of an ideological or epistemological plane that is entirely removed from the world, because as we can see, it was a very sort of everyday thing for Dhammapada, and the notebooks are a very clear material reminder how the list enters the world, and how the list then, as a practice, is really instrumental also in the way that an organization like the Mahabodhi Society is run in very sort of quotidian terms, right? So we have to see this kind of connection, I believe, between the different strands that are coming together, and it's really, in my view, the focus on the practices that allows us to see how a discursive practice, like parataxis, writing things under, one item under the other, also has an impact on the very real world, the material.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Frederik, for the reply on this question. Now, Moitri and Ola, could you have any questions? Yeah, please come here. So Alenko, who is part of this project, he's a fellow. They are doing the digitization. So he has a question for you.
Dr. Schroer, I just want to have one follow-up question from my supervisor, if you don't mind answering. First of all, where do you situate this article? Do you just kind of treat it like something which is within the book history project, or something which is beyond that? Because you actually took a lot of efforts and bringing a lot of interdisciplinary skills into this thing. You have even analyzed handwriting, and you have even analyzed the pen strokes which he was using in making those lists. And this is my first question. The second point is a bit more complex. It's sort of, I think, just let me know if you confirm it or not. I just want to ask that instead of, he was actually a prolific writer, as you could understand, that he was actually writing a lot of editorials for the Mahabodhi Journal itself. So why do you think he was still resorting to making lists and not some full sentences? I understand one part that he was trying to situate the emotions within the larger project of Buddhism, particularly within that is in the form of Mahabodhi Society. But do you think he was resorting to lists primarily because he was trying to balance empiricism and rationalism? So yes, that is my question. Thank you.
Frederik, there is another question. Would you like to take the questions together and reply, or would you like to go one by one?
Perhaps it's better if I reply.
Okay, fine. Yeah, go ahead, please.
While it's fresh in my head. But I also really want to thank you, and I would really want to stress that Alikya and the others, you are also the heroes of this project, right? The people who are doing the actual digitization. It's not an easy process, and it's a hard work, and I know that it involves factors such as back pain. It's not an easy thing, and I think too often in academia, and also in history in particular, we blend out what I think is the largest part of our work is manual labor. It's the acquiring of sources, it's the reading of sources, it's editing PDFs, compiling, files. These sorts of things, I believe, accounts to the largest part of what we do, but we are very silent on it most of the time, right? And it seems like we are all these talking heads sitting in our offices having great thoughts, interacting with this wonderful intellectual tradition, but at the same time, this is also a craft. So my big respect goes to people like you who are really, really instrumental in this work. So I want to thank you in particular for what you're doing and what you have done. Now, coming to your questions. Thank you for stressing and noticing the sort of the interdisciplinarity in the article. I believe that going forward, there is no writing history without this kind of interdisciplinarity. As an aside, this semester, the summer term is currently going on in Berlin. I'm teaching a seminar which is a sort of an introduction to history as a discipline for students in an MA Global History that come from other fields that didn't study history in their undergrads. And so we are kind of engaging with older 19th century historiography and then slowly moving up to the present. Yeah? And I think as I compiled the syllabus, it really became clear to me that there is no way going back to this sort of history writing as, people were advertising of scientific history in the 19th century or even the sort of early 20th century types of history that I can see. Because we have had so many turns, because we have seen so many other things, we have gone beyond the focus purely on the textual, which I think, in my view, there is no going back. So even if we're looking at a document like a notebook, which on the face of it, it's a page that contains text, but it exceeds this in so many ways. As you mentioned, we can see what pens was he using. Was he writing with a pencil? Was he adding notes perhaps later in a different color? Was he writing with a fountain pen, signifying that he had more time, that probably he was sitting in a stationary place? Because sometimes I think he was taking notes on his travels, so he might have been in a railway car, he might have even been in a car, or on a boat. And so all of these things are clues that tell us things that are the larger history of this, that go beyond the purely textual level, that includes pens, the handwriting, the whole materiality of these objects, that always exceeds the textual level, but the textual level, of course, is very, very closely connected to it, so the two are being woven together. So I believe that there's no way around this kind of interdisciplinarity. At the same time, I'm also a little careful of the word interdisciplinarity. History as a discipline has always been very starved of theory and has always pulled other fields into it, right? In the olden days, it was philology, and now perhaps it's sound studies or history of the senses, materiality, etc. But interdisciplinarity also has its limits, right? And so when we talk of interdisciplinarity, I think often it's a very sort of easy or a comfortable kind of interdisciplinarity. And the farther we go from where we are, the harder it gets to do, because when we get to a point where we can't even agree on our notion of evidence or truth or these kinds of fundamental categories, that's, I think, when interdisciplinarity very often breaks down. The second question is a really, really interesting one. Why was Dharmapala why did he revert to list making if we consider that he was such a prolific writer? And he was. He filled his notebooks, he filled his diaries, he wrote these articles. For many years he basically filled the Journal of the Mahaprabhu Society all by himself, which is something that we know from many other periodicals at the time, that very often the figure of the editor wrote the brunt of what we find in the pages of these periodicals. And in the notebooks, we also find many drafts of editorials and articles, and we also find drafts of autobiographical writing that he would later publish in the Journal of the Mahaprabhu Society. So he was preparing things, right? But at the same time, as you said, he was also making this. And I think he might be onto something there. That I don't think it was just a shorthand. I don't think you just compile a list because you don't have enough time to formulate full sentences. I think that the list form and the practice of making lists are connected to particular, as you say, particular interactions between the field of emotions, or also the field of religion, and rationality, perhaps in a larger sense. I don't want to disconnect the two, because we can't disconnect emotions from rationality. We know from our colleagues in psychology that decision making is always connected to emotions. So positing the one against the other isn't really tenable anymore. But I don't think that it was just because he didn't have time. I think it was because it was a practice that he had learned and that he kept seeing, and that was doing particular things for him. So a list had a different function for him. It fulfilled a different function than a text, for example.
Thank you, Frederik. So we can take one brief question, another brief question and brief answer, keeping in mind the time factor. Yeah, yeah. So, Anurag.
Hello, Dr. Schroer. That was a fantastic talk, and I really something when I was reading your paper, something really stood out, and it was like when we are taking the totality of history in these lists that Dharmapala is making, and we are also considering that these notebooks are autobiographical in context where he has to put his own life and the achievements of the Mahabodhi Society in and and he's situating himself and the Mahabodhi Society also in these lists. So where does this actually place Dharmapala and the Mahabodhi Society in this totality of history that he is actually talking about, especially of the Buddhist history that he's talking about? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a great question. It's almost, don't take this wrong, it's almost a bit of a trick question, or it's a tricky question, because everybody knows this. Dhammapada is a figure that many different constituents have, stakes in his figure, right? He's been, after his passing, mostly, strongly been appropriated by Sinhalese nationalists. He's been appropriated by all kinds of circles, yeah? And so everybody also has a stake in Dhammapada. And so then his position in history is also a question of perspective. What the notebooks offer us to see is his own perspective, and I don't want to mince words here. Dhammapada was also a grandiose thinker, and he was also very egocentric. As most of these reform leaders were, I think, if he hadn't been, then he probably couldn't have achieved what he achieved. So his driving motivation was also his self-fashion. And we know that he fashioned himself as an Amritarika, as a sort of kind of celibate. Well, he was also struggling with celibacy and the position of the woman, as we can see in his notebooks. And so he was fashioning himself as a reformer. We know that the sort of topos was around. He also went to the Parliament of Religions, with figures such as Vivekananda, of course, who were also these larger than life, intellectual and religious figures. So Dharmapala he doesn't make himself small in his history lists. Yeah? He also sees himself and his organizations at the moment of the sort of late colonial period as a moment of particular importance for Buddhist history. This also happens simply, in the fact that on the horizon, the 1500 year anniversary was approaching, and we know that later, also other actors were very involved. We also know later years, figures such as Nehru, also really capitalized on Buddhist history. So it was a bit there for the taking, yeah? And then it's a question of how do you see yourself, situate yourself within this list. And so, yeah, I don't think that we should also have illusions about these figures. Yeah, so Dhammapada was a strong figure in history, so he didn't sort of take himself entirely out of it.
Thank you, Frederik. Lastly, where is that Isipatana library? You mentioned that in your paper. I mean, I have no idea about this library.
Rishipoton, Sarnath.
Sarnath, okay. So that's in Sarnath. Okay,
Yes.
Okay.
That's just
Okay, okay. So thank you, Frederik, for joining us from Berlin and for sharing your time and research with us. And we are sure that the conversation will continue. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you. So we have, I think, 2 minutes left for Sam and Ruth to join us. I think they are supposed to join us 2:30 Indian Standard Time, which would be 10:30 UK time. So we'll get to know from Sam about the research dimensions of the EAP project. Sam is a Tibetologist himself, so we are expecting them to join very soon. And once again, by the time both Sam and Ruth join, I think to continue with what Frederik mentioned, I would once again request all the research scholars to read the paper that Frederik has so beautifully written. And as I said, that you get an idea about that history that Anurag tried to mention and hint at, and also the technique of doing research and how do you figure out from series of notebooks different research findings. It's an amazing example of that. Now, as we were talking about right at the beginning, that part of the reasons that we decided to go for this project was that the Mahabodhi Society, and in fact this is something that we have discussed among each other, that the Mahabodhi Society headquarters at Kolkata is located in a very prime location, so visible at the very heart of College Square. But before entering into this project, we didn't have much idea about the kind of archival treasures that they have. And I'm sure that there are other institutions, other archives, and there are members of the audience, and would request them that even they can share their ideas and their views about other small town, non-metropolitan archives that you do not know about. Maybe we can think of future projects on those archives, because we are looking for it. That is one of the reasons that we decided to organize this research colloquium as well, that there will be interactions among different stakeholders, among members of the audience who might be knowing about other archives. As I said, that the metropolitan archives are almost quite well known, but there are areas about which we do not know much. But the small town archives are very important because virtually there is no knowledge about it. So it would be wonderful if you can provide information about different non-metropolitan areas of archiving materials. I know that listening to one of the training programs at Jadavpur University, we got to see that there was someone who did a digitization program of the notebooks of the bowels. Some of the notebooks are burned out and not in a very good condition. And as Abhijit was saying, that it was very difficult to make, to have snaps and digitization of those things, because they were working in a very precarious condition. They didn't have electricity and other congenial atmosphere to continue doing the digitization work. But then we are ready to meet those challenges, and we need information from you so that we can think of applying for another fresh project on those unknown, lesser known, but important archives. We'll just take a break. We're not moving away. We're waiting for Sam and Ruth to join. I think it is time. I'll write to them to check whether they are having any difficulty to join on the Zoom link.